So on one hand, this is a very complicated area, but on the other, it is very simple. When a particular musician plays very musically, we do have a shared understanding as to what we're talking about. We talk about musicianship and musicality as a quality which is somehow in excess of or beyond just getting the notes. Being musical, I think we all agree, is what happens when we play what is beyond the notes. However, I think there is a danger of making an illusion between being musical and talent. We often think that those who seem to freely express themselves whilst playing somehow do so because of a natural feeling for the music and a seamless technique. Whilst musical brass playing often sounds effortless and as a byproduct of a super or a really efficient technique, we must caution about thinking that musicianship comes after technique or as a result of technique. I often ask my students to think about a scenario in which they could choose between an elixir which gave them a perfect technique or an elixir of musicianship which gave them perfect musicianship. They struggle with this. It's difficult because thinking about technique and musicianship as being separate to each other is difficult because in reality the two are very closely related. The pianist Daniel Barenboim has expressed the idea that when he plays a note on the piano at the wrong dynamic, it is both a technical and musical problem. He's also said that in music, you cannot play two notes without learning the coexistence of passion and discipline. Technique and musicianship coexist. This is what the famous pedagogy of the tuba player Arnold Jacob was based on, that thinking musically somehow organized our neural response to play with an efficient technique. Thinking about technique as a primary before music does not help musical thinking in the same way. But what is playing musically? There are so many reasons why this is such a stimulating topic, and one of them is to do with notation, and that's what we're going to focus on today. As Charles Rosen, another famous pianist, put it, for practical purposes, not every aspect of music can be written down. Notation is selective. Only certain musical elements or parameters are chosen. Rosen and many others have written about how notation was one of the main reasons that the whole idea of Western classical music came into existence. Rosen also pointed out that Western classical music has survived because of the differing approaches to interpreting notation. Think about, for example, the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It is the most recorded symphony ever, but yet no two recordings play those opening bars the same. It is the indeterminacy of notation, that there are musical elements that lie beyond notation, that makes classical music what it is. That we can have a conversation about the difference between what a performer does and what a composer wrote on the page is actually an elixir in itself. If there was only one way of playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, would we still be playing it as much as we do today? In fact, that piece goes through cycles in the way that we play it, almost like the way that fashions do. What I'm really interested in is why we often think about our job as a performer is to simply play the composer's intentions, and that somehow what the composer intended is represented and coded by their notation alone. If conductors and orchestra who have recorded Beethoven's Fifth were all doing exactly what Beethoven wrote on the page, then perhaps they all need to go to Specsavers. Trevor.
So my contribution to this discussion is a sort of pre-sequel, if the word exists, to what I think that Richard might be speaking about, and it certainly complements what Bede was saying. It's about the place of improvisation in building musicianship, not just improvisation in its own right, but in building musicianship. It needs more discussion than I can give it here, but I use the phrase for this talk, performing music from a distant world. Can we go to the next one, please? Thanks. So the distant world I'm talking about is not a place, but it's the past. And I call it the distant world because it's a nice sort of thing to do, but also because the greatest proportion of the music we perform today in the classical world is from the past, and so that is the distant world that I'm talking about. The next slide, please. Of course, none of us has ever been to that distant world, so we have to rely on what historians tell us about it, and I suppose here I'm complicit because I'm a music historian. So next slide, please. But how do historians know about performance in the past? Because they haven't been there either. Usually they find out by looking at what they call sources, but in fact, much of it could also be called litter, various objects and materials, much of which has been randomly abandoned and equally randomly found. And the next slide, please. Now here's a collection of the stuff from the litter train of history. Now I use this sort of stuff as a music historian. A photograph of a Civil War band, a receipt for the import of an instrument into the United States in the 19th century, an old instrument in spookily perfect condition from a museum. Then there are books, like in the top right-hand corner, Fantini's famous trumpet manual. But Fantini didn't write his book for the future. He wrote it for the present that he knew, the age in which he lived, where improvisation was a common part of musical life. And don't think that we can trust recordings because they actually were literally a recording of music, because the whole idea of recordings is so fraught with problems that it should be a subject for a completely different a different presentation. But the one thing which may well have been intended for the future was the music itself. And that is enshrined in the written music that we see here. It's as Bede suggested, it's extremely unsuccessful in indicating precisely what the expression is supposed to be. But that is the main focus that modern musicians use for performance. And I think there is something important that is missing about this, and something that was always there in the past, but is largely absent from musical life in the time in which we live. So the next slide, please. Look at these images and think about the odd one out. There's Louis Armstrong, there's the Wallace Collection, you've got the Beatles, and you've got a 17th century band. Now, it could be that the Beatles is the odd one out because they don't play brass instruments. But it could also be the Wallace Collection, because they alone in this group need to have music in front of them in order to play. And there's very good reason for that. They play vast and varied repertoire. It would be totally impossible for them or anyone who has the sort of work that they do to perform without written music. The 17th century musicians relied on memory, but they probably had a much, much smaller repertoire than the hundreds of pieces rather, that the Wallace Collection have to play in a single year. And then there's Louis Armstrong and the Beatles, who between them, in my view, changed the course of music in the 20th century. Louis Armstrong could read music by the time he was about 21. The Beatles couldn't read music. But neither Louis Armstrong nor the Beatles actually used music. It was written music. They improvised, they experimented, they used their musical imaginations, and what they produced was really important for all of us. So the next slide, please, the final one. So the point I want to stop is this. The litter of the distant world helps us understand the past. But perhaps our obsession, our necessary focus with reading the instructions contained in written music makes us miss something that should be spontaneous to us all, the spirit of the music. Musicians of the past improvised and experimented much more than we do today. How much time in conservatoires do students, or indeed us as musicians, spend in private, inventing our own melodies as we play, refining them, articulating them? I'm not talking about virtuosity here, I'm talking about expression and invention. Could we give written music from the past greater and more accurate expression if we spent some of our time trying to use our imaginations and natural musical instincts by improvising? So that's what I wanted to say, and I may say a bit more later on, but back to you, Bede.
Thank you very much, Trevor. There's so many things to comment on, but one which, before we move on to Richard, because it's a perfect transition to him, I will just say that your suggestion that should we spend more time with notation, imagining it, that I have this idea that we're not very good at giving ourselves permission to do that, because there's so many examples as to how things should be played, and perhaps this conservatoire education, there's something fundamental which starts before that in our learning journey. Perhaps when we're children, we could maybe consider that point later when we talk about teaching children, and whether something can be encoded into our approach to notation at an earlier age. But Richard, so much of what Trevor was saying must have been a joy for you to hear, because you've been saying this for years. Richard, Michael, hello. Richard, Michael.
Right, okay, yes, got you now. Okay. Right, okay. That was wonderful. I absolutely chime with that. So what I'd like to, and the reason that I agree with that is I'm going to play you 3 tunes and ask you all what's the common thing. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. And here's the last one. And the answer is they were written by Paul McCartney, that was Blackbird, Earl Garner wrote Misty, and Django Reinhardt wrote Nuage. None of those 3 musicians could read music at all, but they could play music. And I think it's really important that for the development of anybody who's learning music is they should be able to play tunes. They should be able to hear something and just play it. The way that we learn speech is that we copy our parents. You copy their inflections, you copy their dynamics. Now, and yet, from my generation, when you went to a music lesson, there was a music page put up in front of you, and you read it, and you tried to read it. But so you had, that was one way of learning. The other way of learning was you get your guitar and you try and go, what does George Harrison do when he's playing that guitar solo? How does Jimi Hendrix get that sound? Or for me, it was at the piano. How Dudley Moore was my first big influence. How can I get that? How can I get that fabulous sound? And the only way you get it is you experiment. But there is, my feeling is that for most people, up until this present generation, music has been taught entirely through reading off the page. It's not. It's something that should be absolutely instinctive. The great composers of the past, like Beethoven, Bach, were fantastic improvisers. Where did this go wrong? At the university a couple of years ago, I did this wonderful gig with Siets de Vries, an organist from Holland, and Charles Ballier, a jazz organist and also a cathedral organist from France. The 3 of us, a Dutchman, a Frenchman, and a Scotsman, all spoke the same language. the same musical language. We'd never worked together. And when we did a concert, we were just given themes and we improvised on them and we played together. And it was all done through the ears. And my two colleagues said, yeah, when you're learning to play Baroque music, you should improvise Baroque music. Bach would have clucked his pupils over the head with a stick if they couldn't improvise. I discovered that when we went to Leipzig. It's vital that you improvise. And I think that's where we've gone wrong. But I'm very, very hopeful that things are improving and that teachers, but the fact there's musicians like Winter Marsalis, talk brass, fantastic jazz player, but more than anything else, a fantastic musician. And what I want to turn out from is musical people who can play tunes, who can read, but can also improvise and just get into that deeper meaning of music. That's what I've got to say.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm sure there's lots of people who are thinking about the memory aspect that must be involved in improvisation. And there's so many things that we can talk to about in future sessions, I'm sure. But John Wallace, how far do you think we can take, musical thinking? What are there limits to musicianship?
So, Bede, what a huge subject this is. How far can we go with musicianship? Well, if we improvise very far, we can take it all through life. Children are very musical, and also they're great, as we all know, at improvising. We seem to be all born musical and improvisatory, but what happens to us as we grow up and become adult? If we don't use these things, our innate musicality and our ability to improvise, then they fall into disuse. Those of us, like you, Richard, who are fortunate enough to have started early and continue to make music and improvise throughout life, learn that music is as infinitely complex as humanity itself. It's a form of non-verbal communication which transmits very powerful emotions deep into the brain, much more effectively than speech: love, hate, joy, despair, and everything in between. And musicians learn to use the entire gamut of human expression in their music making and their musicality. And I think musicality is something that accrues throughout life, building like the rings in a tree from the childlike simplicity we all started with. But the great musicians never lose that childlike simplicity of direct expression they started with. And that's the crux of musicality. It's impossible to put onto paper. It's both oral and aural transmission. Notation is at best inexact and leaves so much room for the four I's, as I call them: interpretation, inspiration, intuition, and imagination.
Thank you, John. I love those four I's. You're very good at coming up with little concise ways of thinking like that. I remember when I was a student, still am a student, that we had a class with you on the Hummel trumpet concerto and the third movement, where there's just a descending chromatic line and chromatic notes descending, and over the top of them, I think in most editions, is just a wavy line. Your scholarly advice at that point is that a wavy line just means do something.
Yes, that's right. Now, Hummel, I'm glad you brought up the Hummel, because Hummel was a great improviser. Beethoven was so in awe of Hummel as an improviser, he booked him in advance for his own funeral to improvise at his funeral. So when I first did this piece with the Philharmonia and Muti, and I asked William Mann, the Mozart expert, who did all of the program notes for the Philharmonia, what the wavy lines meant, he said, oh, that's a common thing in Mozart operas in the manuscript. It just means do something. It means improvise. It's the same at the beginning of the second movement. A lot of people think that's a vibrato. Ed Tarr started that idea, but again, it's do something, improvise. He didn't have enough time to write it all down.
Amazing.
Right.
Hello, Tony.
Tony.
Hello, Bede.
Do Do you have anything that you can play for us, and as an example for what we're talking about, not necessarily with improvisation, but with, you know, notation and how it's not quite as exact? And
so I'm just going to play you a bit of a tune, and then, which is of course spelled CHOON, and then Chris is going to put the tune on the screen, but I'm going to play you without the music first. Now, if Chris could put the music with the words up on the screen, and you can see that the words are incredibly sad. It's about, where has my Highland laddie gone? And he's gone off to fight in a battle. So, teasing what Stephanie said earlier, that Baroque and medieval and Renaissance players really think about the words to the music that they're playing. Well, sometimes for us 19th century people, it's really important to think about the words as well, because it helps us put ourselves in a mindset where the music can have more significance. And this is a song all about having your true love hundreds of miles away from you, but still being totally connected to them. There you go.
thank you very much, Tony, for that example. Paul, we've got an example from you next about thinking about playing from notation.
What do you do when there's no words and there's millions of notes? Once you stop panicking at all the black, once the black mist descends, you can sort of just try and play a tune. Now I'm going to start it, and the first time I play it, I'm going to play it absolutely. You can't see it on this just now, but the metronome marking for this is 72. So I'll just so that's 72. So you could just play it exactly as written at the tempo. Right. Not only is it quite untidy and messy, it's quite boring as well, isn't it? Would you agree? Anybody? Can you hear me?
Your playing's never boring, Paul, but perhaps that time it was.
Yeah, well, so you could just bash through it and play the notes, but that's not really anybody's intention, not least the composers. Now, there's been a lot of talk about improvising here today, and this is sort of people don't like. I'm one of them. I don't like improvising because you don't always know what notes to play. So Malcolm Arnold here has written out a sort of improvisation for you, but that's still what notes you play is still not quite not enough, really, is it? Playing the notes is great. Playing all the notes written out is brilliant. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to try and get all the way through it. Now, as a younger man, I might have just put on my horned helmet and just had a bash at it and go ba 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 ba. But you can see there's no dynamic to start with. So why start too loud? We go up to fortissimo here. Can you see my little hand, my cursor thing?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's quite loud, but it's not all that loud. So I'm going to try and play it again and see if this is more interesting. With my little mistake because of the darkness, I think that was a little bit more interesting. Now, what I would like to try and say, what to take away is the music's got to have a character as well, whether that's angry or happy or sad. To me, that has got, there's two characters, there's a battle between a very angst-ridden, nervous person, neurotic person here, and then a really sweet, loving. It's a bit like Gollum in Lord of the Rings, switching between and everything's fine, you know.
Also, it strikes me, Paul, that when you played it the second time, you gave yourself space for the technical challenges. So this is a very important thing, how musical thinking and technical thinking actually need to coexist with each other. How if you use a musical brain and make something which is satisfying musically, that often solves technical problems for you at the same time.
Absolutely. It makes it easier and it makes it sound better, which is, if there's anybody out there that I teach has probably heard me say this before, if it makes it sound better and it makes it easier, then do it.
Thank you, Paul. Fergus, do you have an example for us?
The thing that I wanted to focus on was, obviously we've spoken a lot about notation and where there's not very much actually written within the notation. This is the Gigue, the last movement of Bach's third cello suite. Apologies to purists, this is it written for French horn, so it's written an octave higher in treble clef, and I'm going to play it in the pitch of F rather than the original concert pitch. Before I go on to this though, I'd just like to touch on a couple of things that people have said. I thought what Richard was saying about how we start to learn speech by listening to our parents and the words that they say, I find it quite interesting that often when we're teaching, we put words to things in the same way that he did when he was teaching his blues at the beginning, and suddenly people learn things much faster when you apply words to whatever the rhythm or the melody actually is. I think there's got to be an interesting element to that. You know, it obviously hooks into something, that an innate way of learning that we have. This jig obviously is based on, a dance form, the jig, well known in Ireland and in Scotland, and it needs to have a rhythmic feel to it. When you play in a jazz band, as I've had the fortune to do in a few times, the rhythmic feel is given to you by the rhythm section. That's why they're there. You know where all your notes are going to fall. So even if you're looking at something quite complex and you're thinking, oh gee, how's that going to work? And you're sitting starting to do the arithmetic on it, quite often the minute the rhythm section starts, it just all falls into place and you think, right, it's like that. This music here, if I just play it exactly just without any kind of extra. Now, it doesn't really make any sense there. It's just a set of notes put together. And it's not helped by the fact that the editor here has actually put in a slur here between these two notes, which doesn't fit with the way this should be. If I play a little bit of the jig at the end of the second note, the second suite, sorry, it's far clearer because there's accents and emphasis. And suddenly the whole thing has a shape, it's got a bounce, and you can actually imagine yourself jumping to it. And that's what this piece here requires. Interestingly, the student that I found picked this up fastest was actually a girl who is also a very accomplished violinist. And I told her that she just needs to think about it as a bowing action, that for the third beat of the bar, there needs to be an up bow and then a down beat in the first bar. So you get this jump-ba, jump-ba, jump-da. And when you add that into this piece, it starts to make a lot more sense. And so on, and it gives us that musical feel, the rhythmic feel that's so essential in how we perform it. But obviously, in the way that this has been notated, none of that is really written down.
Thank you for making that important point about the inner rhythmic vitality, because, you know, we often think about musicianship in all sorts of different ways, but we often think about rhythm as being something which is fixed, but rhythm has scope for flexibility as well. John Miller, how do you go about communicating this to musicians who want to deal with the certainty, who are maybe making orchestral jobs, auditions, where they want to know exactly what they're meant to do?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, and I'll get specifically onto your topic in just a sec. I would say that all these things that we've discussed this afternoon, about interpretation, awareness of style, and the ability to deliver it, they all tie together. And this afternoon, we had a very good example from Richard Michael of setting the scene. The wonderful warm up for half an hour. It brought everybody in, and it involved everybody, and it made everybody incredibly engaged. And there's an incredible mix of just awareness and interest and discipline as well. And I think once these things are there, I think things can happen. I think that performing, whether sitting in an orchestra or trying to get into an orchestra or getting through an audition, etc., it involves quite a lot of discipline and the ability to deliver. And I think a big part of this is setting the scene, so that somebody can feel well. Having had a few good experiences, like we did at 2 o'clock today, so that in my own teaching, I think this I suppose this gathering of good habits is a central thing to what I do with so many students.
Sorry, John, we can go on. Pardon me.
I would say there's probably another important point that I would make to that. My position as being a teacher comes from my experience of being a player. I've sat there in symphony orchestra and elsewhere and played solos in front of them. I know what it feels like. I can smell it. And I know what the performance element is. So I can empathise and help these matters. As well as that, I'm the custodian of a lot of traditions. Some of the way that I play the cornet or play the trumpet is how I was taught when I was a teenager, and how I was taught in my 20s. I'm passing on a lot of ideas from other players. So and I think many of these things they come on down through a line.
Yes,
I do my best to pass on what I think are good messages.
You absolutely do, and yourself and John Wallace in the Wallace Collection, listening to you both, I often think of it as that it's when hearing you play, it's like living history, and that's maybe the point that Trevor and John Wallace was making about the aural tradition. So play it from one generation to another. Thank you for that, John. Sandy, you're there in the Laidlaw. We're going to finish with some comments with you, and then maybe just some questions if we've got time. Sandy, what's your thoughts about this topic for the beginning for starting players off?
Well, I always approach it as teaching the kids that the most important thing is to tell a story with the music, and not to worry if they miss notes, because missed notes happen. They don't matter. But that you want to create the line in your ear, and then you want to make things more exciting by using dynamics or different articulations, but you always want to express some kind of story. Or, as Tony was saying, if you're playing a song that has words, then you want to actually mimic the words or use the words as a guide. But just get away from the page, listen to things, and have fun with it.
Absolutely. There's been some interesting chat going on in the chat bar about that, in talking about of storytelling with music, because a story, of course, is once upon a time, and music can be about that. but also music doesn't necessarily have to be about something to have a narrative. You know, some of the most complex feelings that we can experience don't necessarily have a vocabulary which we can attach to them. And one of the most profound things about music is that it often somehow can get to a place which language can't. And I love the similarities between language and music, but there are of course some differences. So we'll put this all into action next year. Thank you very much, everyone, for being us to the Wallace Collection. Trevor Herbert, Richard Michael, Sandy McGrattan, Steph, thank you very much for being with us. It's been a great thing to do. We'll be doing more sessions like this, and keep your eye out for them.